I'm calling together the July 21st, 2021 Board of Supervisors, Placer County special meeting, specifically a workshop to talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, and we'll defer the pledge of. Oh, is Jim? Jim's here. That.
Yeah, he is here.
Yeah, he was in just a minute.
Jim?
Did he go out?
He did say don't start with I'll start by leading the flag pledge. Oh, no, well, here's Supervisor. Flag salute, please. Yeah. To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So again, today this is a special workshop where we're going to discuss our American Rescue Plan Act funding, and I'm going to turn it over to County Executive Todd Leopold.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, supervisors. So this afternoon, rarely do you get an opportunity to have these kind of conversations. The funding that was brought as a result of the COVID and ultimately the American Rescue Act plan dollars creates tremendous opportunity, I think, for you as a board and really as a community as a whole. So today's conversation is going to talk quite a bit about what we've done in terms of eligible versus non-eligible uses. We're going to speak to general programmatic areas, talk about more of a funding strategy as it relates to these dollars, get some general concurrence and some direction from you all as we move on. Obviously, we'll talk about timelines, but these is a kind of a multi-year projects and funding arrangements, but we need to have some direction about where we want to allocate some of those dollars. So Daniel's here and Barbara's been instrumental helping out. We're going to walk through the slide presentation that you have, and then we're going to open up for questions and talk about the funding strategy. So Daniel, I'll start with you, and then we can answer any questions.
Good afternoon, Chair Wygant, members of the board. I'm Daniel Chatney with the County Executive Office. And I have a short slide presentation for you to kind of kick off today's discussion. Our agenda for today wanted to cover an overview of our CARES Act funding allocation, an overview of the American Rescue Plan funding and eligible uses, discuss a funding strategy and board priorities, identify eligible projects and requests, and then discuss board directions and the next steps to come. So as a reminder, in 2020, we received $41.1 million of CARES Act revenue. About 40% of that was distributed to local businesses and nonprofits, and the remaining $24 million was appropriated to various county response to the pandemic. This is an overview graph of how some of those funds were distributed. Again, the Placer Shares program is the largest at $14.8 million. Similar and related to that was the Placer Eats and Drinks program that focused assistance to restaurants and bars at $1.2 million. There's a $1.3 million allocation to support Project Home Key. $10.6 million was allocated to public health or to the Department of Health and Human Services for their various support activities in the COVID response. IT, telework, and remote services were instrumental in allowing lots of county departments to work remotely and to continue offer our core services to our public who, while counters and for public access were closed. And then miscellaneous county operations at $7.9 million. Some of the things that went into this category were simple sanitation and cleaning services of all the offices and high touch points. But through the funding strategy and the actions that the board took, it did free up resources, financial resources that could be committed to other high priority projects, including tree mortality projects in the public right-of-way, chipping programs, and nearly $700,000 for the homeless liaison team. So we were able to put some money that was freed up in the general fund towards some of those high priority projects in the county. Back on June 22nd, we presented just kind of a high-level discussion on the ARPA and the eligible uses in that. I received board direction to prepare a workshop for more in-depth discussion and talk about board priorities and potential uses of the funds. So just background on ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law on March 11th of 2021. Part of the act established the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. And this is really the focus of our conversation today, is just that one piece of it. Under those funds, $350 billion in fiscal relief for local governments, $65.1 billion for counties, and Placer County's share was $77,370,739. So some of the key dates that we have under the Act are the funds will apply to costs incurred after March 3rd of 2021. So they're all forward-thinking. Funds must be obligated by December 31st of 2024. Funds must be fully spent by December 31st of 2026. We have an interim spending report due on August 31st. And then our first annual recovery plan performance report will be due on August 31st as well. So the focus on eligible categories of uses is going to be on the response to the public health emergency and the negative economic impacts, public sector revenue loss, and water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. So when we talk about a funding strategy, we're talking about something that would potentially look like this. You know, 3 buckets: infrastructure, COVID response, and revenue loss being the 3 categories for discussion, and the kind of projects that would go into that. Under infrastructure would be water, sewer, broadband. Under COVID response would be potentially affordable housing projects, physical and mental health support, parks and trails. And then revenue loss is an amount that we can pull from the funding for discretionary government services. Some of the specific restrictions in ARPA are deposits into pension or rainy day funds, using the funds for debt service, legal settlements, and matching funds, unless those matching funds are specifically allowed by a federal program, offsetting tax cuts, or general infrastructure outside of water, sewer, and broadband. I want to talk a little bit about public entity revenue loss. This is, like I said, a category that we can pull from the available funds to cover any calculated revenue loss due to the pandemic. So the way we measure this is we look back 3 fiscal years prior to 2018-19 and calculate our average revenue growth for those 3 years. If that number is greater than 4.1%, we can use the greater of 4.1, or our number, or 4.1%. Then for fiscal year 1920, we would take a look at that, or as of December 31st of 2020, if we didn't achieve that 4.9% revenue growth, which was our average, we can claim that amount as revenue loss. So for our first calculation for fiscal year 1920, that amounts to about $550,000. So you'll see that we'll have at least 3 more opportunities to measure revenue loss in December of 2021, 2022, and 2023. So that number can change as we go through the program. Any revenue that we calculate and claim can be used for the provision of general government services. It has the same ineligible uses as the rest of the funds, so no deposits to rainy day funds, pension funds, and the like. And then again, it'll be measured at those 4 specific dates in December. So when we started, after our last conversation, we took a look at project funding requests, and this kind of chart is just kind of meant to show a picture of the things unsolicited that we received. So from internal and external requests or concepts for projects and programs. And we threw up some names, generic names of some of those things. So talking county infrastructure, public health, parks and trails, special district requests, et cetera. The total of those amount to $198 million. And the intent of this slide is to just demonstrate that there are more than enough projects locally to consume all of the $77.4 million. And even when some of these will be deemed ineligible and the like, the number will still be greater than twice as much as the $77 million that we'll have available to disperse. So along that note, what we have is a list of county-specific projects or potential county projects. And these are some that came our way through the various discussions that we've had with some of our county departments and other county staff, and meant to serve kind of as just a guiding document as to what types of projects potentially are eligible and your board may consider funding for. So I'll run through this fairly quickly. Some of these have notes, asterisk notes on there, and it has a little explanation on there identifying some of these things as current county fiscal obligations. So things that we have already committed to spend money on and in those same amounts that this might be able to offset. So just running through the list fairly quickly, sewer is an allowable expense under the infrastructure category. And this is the first one is an extension of a sewer line from the Placer Ranch area basically to the Sunset area. And that project's about $11 million. In order to get to that point first, we would look at doing the Placer Ranch extension to Foothills, and that's a $17 million project. And that's the first one that's asterisked as a current county obligation of $17 million net contribution to that Placer Ranch development. Another project on here, a county project, is the Placer County Government Center campus infrastructure. This would be water and sewer infrastructure to serve the campus, also known as the DeWitt campus, to serve infrastructure to the new HHS admin building, the existing buildings and structures out there. It would include water, replacing antiquated water lines as well as new sewer lines. We've talked a little bit about countywide broadband infrastructure and allocating some number of funds to that. For this exercise, we have $10 million allocated to county broadband infrastructure. We kind of bundled affordable housing and homelessness. It's a broad category and certainly a priority in our county. And so we kind of bundled those together and just put an amount of $8 million on there for further discussion. Parks and trails is an interesting one, and we relate this to ARPA under the mental health connection in improving highly used outside recreational facilities and repairing them from the higher use during the pandemic. So as indoor recreation opportunities ceased, people went outdoors and used those facilities, a little more wear and tear. So we have an opportunity where we can connect some improvements and repairs to that, to ARPA through that. We have a project commonly known as the SB 863. This is the jail mental health facility. So this is a construction, I think, of 45 beds within the South Placer Jail for not the isolation, but for, yes, it's a competency training program and focusing on mental health services as in there, but giving them a separate facility for housing as well. Again, revenue loss. Back on SB 863, we do have a county share obligation, and that estimate right now is $5 million and projected to currently come out of the general fund capital reserves. Revenue loss, as I mentioned on a previous slide, $550,000 is our first initial calculation for December 31st of 2020. Lincoln Sewer, again, this is an item that we share some sewer responsibility to that plant, and this is an item where we would obligate some funds to an upgrade and some maintenance of that plant, I think aeration ponds and some of the ongoing work out there. And then finally, our Health and Human Services Department did submit a request. Their request was just over $15 million. In here we have 13.35. Some of that I think can likely be offset by the CARES funding that they already have. But these items more specifically, and I don't know if Dr. Rob has shown up today or not, but could talk more specifically about these, but they're focused on mental health, substance abuse, and those types of programs, and ramping up some of the programs in the community to service the increased demand on some of those same crisis intervention services that they have. So this is an example list totaling $77.4 million, just rounded up for what we have available under ARPA. So this is what it looks like graphically, with roughly 50% of the funds, $39 million, going into the infrastructure category, 19.85 million that would fall under the health category, and that's the combination of the mental health facility and the HHS request for additional funding to support their programs. 10 million for the broadband, 8 million in affordable housing again, and then the 550,000 for the revenue loss program. So the hope or the areas of consideration as we discuss ARPA and these funding opportunities is board priorities. What's important to the board and the best for the best of the Placer County as a whole. One-time expenses versus ongoing expenses, and whether or not there's any interest in attaching limits to any of the various categories. That's not required under ARPA at all. The $77.4 million can be spread amongst one or all four of the different programs. There are no minimums or maximums. And here's a little timeline for where we are today, or where we actually started. On May 19th of 2021, we received our first half of the $77.4 million. Today, we're here to do this workshop. On August 10th, we are anticipating coming back to the board to confirm the projects and kind of the categories of funding. That will serve our first required reports at the end of August. And then our plan going forward is to tie ARPA and this ARPA conversation to our quarterly budget and fiscal updates to your board. So we'll take a segment of that presentation that I do each quarter and build out a discussion on ARPA, how much we've spent, which projects are moving forward, kind of the status of those projects as well, just to improve our transparency to the public and to the county on where we're spending those funds and how we're progressing. Also to keep an eye on those same projects and address any issues that might pop up, whether or not timing issues are going to prevent a project from being completed in time, and whether we need to switch gears or reassign funds to a different project, that we'll have ample opportunity to address those things early and often, and carry those updates through at least through this first fiscal year 21-22. And then we're anticipating in May of next year to receive the second half of the funds as well. So between now and May of 2020, we have just roughly $39 million of ARPA funds to actually spend. And that is the end of the slide presentation, and I will turn it back to the board and Todd for the workshop discussion.
Thanks. So any questions or comments by board members at this point? Todd?
Yeah, let me make one quick kind of note on the projects themselves. There's a couple things worth noting here. First is the mental health facility for the jail, for example. We have programmed money in for our matching component of that project. However, that project's 6 years plus in the making in terms of getting the state funding. And so obviously escalation of costs have incurred. Right now we're at $5 million. I think we initially programmed in something less than that. So in some of these projects, and this one's, for example, most likely the PCGC infrastructure project, there were funding dollars that we've allocated and built up in the fund to do some of these projects. The opportunity to utilize these dollars without using general fund capital is why we're looking at doing that. That would potentially free up money for you to do other projects. So I want to share that with you because these aren't projects, not all of them, that don't have money to them already. We've already assigned in some of these projects, but not all of them. We can, basically my general thought is areas where there's more restrictive dollars but could be used for a purpose, let's use those first. Ones that have more flexibility, such as general fund capital reserves, we can use that as a secondary aspect. So kind of that's the funding strategy in of itself, but I'm happy to answer or answer any questions you might have about the other projects.
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Jim, go ahead. Your light's not on, though, by the way.
Well, I'm
Oh, yes, because you're not
I felt
there, yeah.
missing tooth. So the idea is some of the items that you just talked about don't qualify for ARPA funds, but we could use the the ARPA funds to do these projects, which we already have county dollars assigned to. We can pull them back and use that for the other projects that.
For some other purpose,
Yeah,
yes.
makes-
These projects, as we've identified at this point, are eligible projects that seem to meet within the time periods that the spending of these dollars would be allowable. And so that's kind of how we've looked at it. Obviously, the funding strategy about infrastructure, COVID-related health expenses, and then revenue loss was kind of the strategy and approach that we took with this.
Okay, good.
Cindy?
So I agree with the strategy. I had a couple questions that maybe need more detail, and are we going to talk about these in more detail now? Should I wait, or?
Please ask a question. Some of them were.
Because some of them I've had briefings on, others I haven't.
Okay.
So those that I've had briefings on, I think I'm pretty clear. The public won't know because they haven't had those briefings, so I don't know if we want to talk more. But the two in particular that I'm murkier on are parks and trails for 1.5 million. What are we going to do? I mean, 1.5 million is not much money to do anything with in parks and trails. So I see Ken back there, but I don't know if that was Andy or Ken, or do you know more details?
Yeah.
Supervisor, I'll try to answer that. So it was an amount it's a plug essentially at this point. I mean, it's not based in any real estimate on any specific project that we want to put money towards. It is an opportunity, as like Todd kind of mentioned, that new source of funds that we can address some maybe more long-term pending issues in our parks and trails system. I think I kind of mentioned in my presentation that the higher use of those facilities that we currently have in place probably cause some more depreciation of the equipment. So, equipment replacement in specific parks or repairs of restroom facilities or those kinds of things. And it's supported in that mental health connection of getting people to continue to use the outdoor resources and improve their mental health conditions and physical health for that matter too.
Yeah,
But-
it's just having been in that industry for a while, that's not much money
Sure.
to do anything significant. And so I don't mind having a placeholder there, but then what are our constraints if we say it's in this category, but then later we decide we want to move it?
If I could just clarify,
Yeah.
so what I'm thinking based on Cindy's comments is, let's say we say, yeah, parks and trails are a priority, but as we go forward, maybe we decide we want it not to be 1.5 but 3. Can we do that? Is that kind of where you?
Or vice versa.
Vice
If
versa,
that
right.
1.5 would go further in serving broadband, then maybe I'm going to say, we've had this run on grants, we have opportunities in broadband
Right.
to serve our underserved communities, so.
I think the answer is yes on both fronts. I mean, in the event that you may want to put some more money towards that, that's fine, or you want to do less. We haven't identified a project for
Okay.
parks and open space. I think that's the short answer. But I will tell you, and I'll just use affordable housing, homelessness, there's a demand greater than $8 million out there. And so I think that's where kind of the conversation about priorities really comes into play here, because we could easily allocate it to a couple other functions that this kind of
But
hits the
it's
surface.
an eligible category, and so for instance, we were already setting aside the 17 million for the Placer Ranch extension. We knew we had to fund that. Theoretically, hypothetically, whatever we want to say, we could move that 17 million into affordable housing.
That's true.
Okay.
Just to expand on that answer just a little bit more, the benefit of having the quarterly reports that we submit to the Treasury as well as the annual performance report, much like we did with the CARES Act funding, is it's kind of it's a living document. As those things become known, a project is deemed ineligible or significantly higher or different funding sources needed for that, we can amend those reporting documents as such and then report what the new plan will be.
Okay, great.
Account for that.
And then also on that sewer extension to Sunset area, the 11 million, remind me, was there a match on that, or is that our?
Yeah, so that, at this point, there isn't a match that's been formally identified, but I do think we're going to have conversations. This is the segment from the casino to basically the starting point of Placer Ranch.
Okay.
There's a lift station, there's some heavy infrastructure there that's going to take place. We are going to have conversations with the casino as well, because they have a vested interest in getting off their package plant right now. This actually goes to a main, the Pleasant Grove sewer facility. So there is some opportunities here. We also look at, when I look at economic development, the Sunset area is where we see industrial development that's already planned for. Infrastructure is what's limiting that activity from taking place, and that's why this opportunity to potentially do that while allowing the casino, they can't really expand. They have opportunities for growth and development, but they can't, in essence, expand beyond the plant that they have now, but they'd have the opportunity if they're off of the package plant.
So we could get reimbursements over
Correct.
time through connection fees or other people buying
That's
into
correct.
that, and then that would free up general fund again, supplementing our general fund to do other activities. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's
Okay.
that's our intent.
Okay, and that's a county project. And then finally, the HHS request is, I haven't had a briefing on that. So of the 350,000, just kind,
So
you talked about mental health, substance abuse, being the largest share of our countywide budget. Yeah, okay, is Rob on there?
And I apologize, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I did have or invite Public Works, CEDRA, and HHS minimally to be here to help support some of the more technical questions. So, Dr. Rob,
Great.
if you'd like to take that one.
Sure, yeah. I'll just briefly go over the HHS request. So, as Daniel mentioned, the original request for $15.1 million, and that was really divided up between our adult system of care, children's system of care, and public health. Actually, the majority was in for adult system of care, about $8.9 million, and that was actually about $6.9 million of that was for this crisis center at Kirby Hills that I know I've talked with some of you about. Really, coming out of the pandemic, we saw a lot more need for an actual crisis center. We've been doing crisis response, kind of mobile crisis response teams, but and talking with our hospitals, it's something. One of the biggest challenges they had, even really pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, it became especially burdensome to have people coming to the emergency department, kind of filling up our emergency department beds due to behavioral health crises. So that's actually right there. The $6.9 million is over a third of the request, and that would be funding of operational costs for the 3 years during and actually to do a pilot. So that the intent would be this would be temporary funding, sort of like our whole person care funding, to establish an operational model that works, but also a financial model, because these crisis units, why haven't we done this in the past? They're really expensive, but to create a model where we can have savings and maybe have others like the hospitals helping to fund this. Right now, and of the hospitals from a fiscal perspective, we're hit pretty hard with COVID, and so there was some talk about them funding this, but maybe not so much in the short run. So that's the first out of the adult system of care, and really the largest line item request for that crisis center at Kirby Hills. The next one for substance use disorder services, in particular for pregnant and parenting women. So that was another $1 million. There's $1 million to acquire additional residential treatment and recovery residences in Placer County. So during the pandemic, we had a real problem finding these residential treatment for people with substance use disorders. And then those are the three for adult system of care, and those totaled almost $8.9 million. And then within the children's system of care, another $4.2 million in requests, $1.2 million of that for expanded family crisis services, a mobile team for family crisis services, increasing home visiting and child welfare support, and then increasing housing for transitional age youth and former foster youth. And that might include purchase of a home for one of our service providers or other housing for that accepts foster youth. So those are the requests for children's system of care, totaling a little over $4.2 million. And then finally, of this $15.1 million, $2 million for additional funding for public health through the end of 2024 to supplement the ELC and other public health funding. If you'll recall, we're getting a lot of funding right now for public health, but it has lots of strings attached and is very categorical. And so the thinking, we have very, very limited discretionary funding for public health activities. It's really the only source is either county general fund or health realignment, which continues to dwindle the health realignment funding. And so this would be an opportunity to supplement that and really having some locally controlled funding for public health that doesn't have state strings attached as far as scope of work, et cetera. So that's an overall summary of the request for $15.1 million. As far as I know that the 13 point something million, I don't have in front of me that in the final request. I'm not sure exactly which line items were taken to go into that final roll up that's presented to you today. But happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And I just, so from my understanding, then everything else on this list, other than revenue loss, is infrastructure potentially. Correct? And then the HHS request. Is that?
Mostly, yes. So, for example, the mental health facility, that would actually fall under the COVID response category, under the mental health category, and not under infrastructure, because it would be more than just sewer and water. Mm-hmm. The affordable housing homelessness could fall under the mental health and COVID impact, but it could also, depending on the type of project undertaken, could fall under infrastructure if it was just sewer and water or broadband.
Good clarification. But in general,
yes,
this one is more service oriented on HHS request, and the others might have components that are operational but are primarily infrastructure, because that's getting back to the philosophy of one time. And this is over, the HHS requests are to cover 3 years of these sorts of operational.
That's correct.
Okay. That was all my questions now.
And to just add a comment onto Dr. Rob's comment, so their request was at 15.1. It came out to 13.3 on this chart. And this chart, again, is a potential list, a list of potential projects. I think there's probably a fairly strong perception or assumption that these numbers will change, and they won't all come in rounded to the even zero, and they will fluctuate up and down. So, to present this as a full picture of the 77.4 available, we basically just took the $2 million out of that request just to balance the chart for today's discussion anyways.
Thank you.
So I think next I'll open it up to county staff to make any comments or presentations they wish to make up, and then after that, public, and we'll then bring it back to continue our discussion unless there are any other board questions or comments at this time. Bonnie, are you good? Okay. Does anyone from staff wish to add anything to the mix currently?
Okay, if not, then I'm going to call them up.
Here's a guy who says, I'm not passing up this opportunity.
I can't shut up. Steve Pedretti, Cedra. My only thought, it's certainly the sewer, very supportive of that. North Auburn Sewer is another one I wanted. I understand there's a limited amount of money. We have obtained a grant for design of the first section of sewer in North Auburn. There's a remaining sewer design that we'd like to get going on. I'm looking for money to give to Ken because I'd like him to do the design for that second half. Maybe up to $1 million. I don't know if it fits here or where we can get it, and probably adjustments can be made. But I just want to throw that out there. So, not the actual construction. We hope to get grants. I hope to get a grant for the design as well. I just don't know the timing on that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
And I'm always trying to move quick. So
those are the kinds of things that I think Cindy was sort of drilling down into. This money is more discretionary than what generally we have available to us through different resources. So if that frees up something else, then it's not that the projects aren't of equal importance, but how we get there is something that if we're shrewd, we could maybe do a lot more than we would have otherwise.
Sure, no problem.
And in particular, I'm sure Supervisor Holmes and I both feel there's a lot of Western focus with a lot of the infrastructure money, and we'd want to free up money that could be used in some other areas of the county for infrastructure. Right?
Oh yeah, any way we can light, shoot, and steal and get the money.
And over time, if some of those funds are matched or we get connection fees and reimbursements, we'd want to see that reinvestment. North Auburn in particular has opportunities for a lot of reinvestment.
Yeah.
And housing in particular, so where we could, but sewer is holding us back, so let's make sure we get that addressed.
Mr. Chair, may I chime in on this one? Can you hear me, Robert?
Yes.
Thank you.
I was wondering who that was, though, Bonnie.
Just to Steve's point, which I appreciate, the infrastructure in the North Auburn area, the Bowman area, that's been identified as one of our green zones through SACOG and infill project. The really good news is that the state allocated some dollars for the Green Means Go effort statewide, and so SACOG will get some dollars. So there might be an opportunity for some matching grants from SACOG for a project like the one Steve mentioned, the one in the North Auburn area. So that might be an opportunity of some funds that could be utilized now and matching funds that we might be able to get.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. Good. Any other staff wish to make any comments? Anyone, Megan, on?
Well, I can bring them up. I can ask a question that makes them come up. I can ask a question that makes you guys come up. On broadband, what would we do with $10 million in broadband? You weren't just sitting here for no reason.
That's you, Jarrett. That's all you.
And I'll say in particular for the public record, our letter to Suddenlink has gotten some traction. I want to thank everybody for moving that forward. And in fact, we're really seeing some potential, at least questioning of Suddenlink in their franchise agreement and how things are moving forward. So I really appreciate all the board's support on this issue. And broadband is so critical to our rural communities in particular who don't have, and many of our communities who don't have adequate service for schools, for working from home, and for emergency information. We rely on it, and so what can you do with $10 million that would help our communities?
Absolutely. So thank you for that, Jarrett Thiessen, CIO, Placer County. So right now we're working to develop a broadband strategic plan, which we think it's going to take about 6 months to develop. And we're going to have to work with all the service providers that provide internet service in the county to identify exactly where are the underserved and unserved parts of the county. Right now, we are set to release our first round of grant RFP, which will go out tomorrow, where we are requesting proposals from service providers to basically light up areas of the county, communities, neighborhoods that right now are either underserved or unserved. Once we evaluate those, we will come to the board with a recommendation of which portions of those to fund and which projects we think would be a good idea to move forward. We want to do that in parallel with the broadband strategic plan. Once we get through that broadband strategic plan, we'll have a really good understanding of exactly what types of technologies can help in certain communities and what projects we think would be the best to spend that $10 million on. So after we do that, then we anticipate doing additional rounds of grant funding. The first round, it's going to be really prescriptive to fiber to the home. But in future rounds, we may look at other technologies, fixed wireless, satellite technology, additional fiber to the home, or possibly infrastructure where we're putting conduit in the ground and then leasing that back to service providers. That's kind of the direction that we're going.
And with that, in our briefing, I asked you specifically, and I just want to get on the public record, we can choose the providers and demand certain service standards from those providers if we're granting them money to help meet those needs, correct?
Yeah, definitely. We're putting, terms and conditions in any of the agreements that we have with those service providers to make sure, one, they execute on the project. So if we're funding materials, for example, for a particular project, that project is seen through completion. If it's not, that we have a mechanism to recover those funds, and then that they are meeting those minimum service requirements that we are requiring, such as latency and upload speed, download speed, and that they are providing that minimum level of service to the community.
Because that's part of our issue right now. We have no teeth. When somebody says they're providing something, we can't do anything. So that's why we had to write all those letters. I've learned so much. Thank you for being patient with me, Dieter, especially. But I think that's such an important part of this. If we're going to invest these public dollars, that the public is assured they're going to get that service from those investments. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot and
That's
make
okay.
you come up here, but I do think for the public to hear what we're thinking about with broadband is important.
Sure.
Jared, if you don't mind, Jared, one of the questions is also about federal and state dollars, because there's a ton of money we're going after, and Joel's sitting in the audience here, but that's been part of the focus is we're not putting our foot off the pedal on getting federal and state dollars to kind of complement the money that's being put here. Is that fair?
That's 100% true. Yeah, we're I think in the governor's budget there's like $6 billion overall throughout the state. So we're expecting a portion of that. The $10 million isn't going to solve the problem. I'll say that right now. It's going to allow us to make a significant impact on the problem. But the additional state dollars, additional federal dollars are equally as important to address this problem. So I do see ongoing effort here in this area. It's not just a one time. We want to make a huge impact one time, but then ongoing. Can we have additional funds and look at doing projects all the time, and also looking at new construction projects that are going on, ensuring that those new construction projects have sufficient broadband to service the needs of the housing units that are being built. So yeah, I think this is ongoing, and this is just the start of it.
Okay, see no other lights on, and Bonnie, do you have anything right at this point? I'll open it up to the public for any comments from the public. If you're here, just come forward and state your name for the record. If you're calling in, do the same.
Hello, board. My name's Jason, and Robert, good to see you back. Hopefully your 13 days off was well spent and you're well rested. So one of the things that I don't have anything really prepared to say, just kind of want to come and kind of see what was going on with this. And with this CARES money, one thing I'm not hearing, I'm not seeing is if there is any kind of strings that are attached to this money, anything that, any guidelines or anything that the county has to, be forced into doing by taking this money. I would like to, kind of hear from you guys the conversation on that. And then also, it sounds like this money is going to be used to offset a lot of projects in place and also a lot of new projects that are up and coming. I guess we can say a wish list for some of these guys. What about not taking this money at all? Is that an option if there are strings attached to this? So what kind of effects would this take place if this money wasn't taken at all? Because it sounds like there's already money in place for a lot of these projects. I would like to hear kind of like that as well, if this money wasn't provided or received, how would you guys proceed from that? And then one other thing, great job on the slide, by the way. One of the things I didn't really see in there that I think, money should be provided for also is that we're seeing more and more reports coming out from adverse effects from people taking, this experimental jab, whatever, a lot of names to it. It would be nice to see some money put in place for that to educate, because I know quite a few people that have taken this as well, and there was no education provided to them whatsoever of what kind of adverse effects has happened. I have 2 personal friends that actually has had heart inflammation from this, and if they would have been educated on this, they probably would have thought more and before taking it. So it would be nice to have, this would probably be a question for the health director, to have money in there for educating of potential adverse effects for this non-FDA experimental. So that's about all I have right now. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe to help get some of the questions on the restrictions on the money, Daniel pretty well covered those, I think, in the beginning as related to the infrastructure is limited to sewer, water, broadband.
Correct.
There's a bucket there that's available for lost revenue, but it's based on calculation that had parameters, restrictions to it.
Correct.
And you covered everything else, I think, pretty well, but there aren't any other strings other than the ones you mentioned. And the one question, do we have, I'm assuming we could deny the money. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I don't, Supervisor or Chairman, I don't know how the process would work to deny that. There would have been probably an opportunity to not request the funds. I mean, there was an affirmative action we took to request the funds, and then they were allocated directly to the county. So, I mean, at this point, going forward, the Treasury has an opportunity to claw back any funds that are unspent or any funds that were spent on projects deemed ineligible and those types of things. But as far as, you get this money and the restrictions are fairly clear, no deposits into pension or rating day funds, and those things are pretty well spelled out, as is the guidance on the eligible expenses. So we don't feel like we're going to run into any issues there.
But they were just and only the ones that you
mentioned.
Discussed. Okay. Yes, please. Next.
My name is Tina Begley. With Jason's comment of a couple of friends who had the inflamed heart after the Wonder Jab, 65% of people who have inflammation die. There are 40,000 doctors plus across America who have all signed a statement saying that how COVID was handled in the U.S. was a complete debacle. And there are hundreds of doctors, world-renowned, highly educated doctors around the world who are coming forward saying that this gene therapy has never been tested on humans before. Every time they've tried it on animals, every single animal died. And the statistic that I'm hearing again and again is that 65 to 70% of the people who receive both jabs will die in the next 2 years. So, little math. Placer County has roughly 350,000 people in it. And I think from Rob Oldham about a month ago, he said that 44% of Placer County had both jabs. I'll round it up to 45% just for easy math. That is 157,000 people. Now, if these doctors are right, and God forbid that they are, but if they are, 65% of that number is 102,000 people potentially could die in the next 2 years. Does Placer County have cemetery space and crematoriums available for that many people over the next couple of years? I'm thinking that we should allot a line item for that, and then if it doesn't happen, thank God, we'll absorb it somewhere else. But I think that you seriously need to consider that there could potentially be a lot of deaths.
Hello, my name is Michael. I just wanted to ask a couple questions based on what Jason had asked. you said there was no ties, but I was wondering, was the local emergency tied to the money? Did we have to remain in a local emergency? Okay, all right, okay. Now, what happens, there's a lot of talk about us being locked down again. There's going to be the Delta variant and all that stuff in the fall. So does that mean we have to lock down again in the future? What are their plans? And is the money tied to that as well? I was listening to a talk yesterday, and it was very interesting. I don't remember the speaker, but she was talking about and showing a lot of evidence that the lockdowns, the arrows, all the masks, the forced vaccines, or at least talked about mandated vaccines is basically similar to torture. And I hear like a lot of money is going into Health and Human Services for medical care and stuff like that. Well, aren't we, if this is true, aren't we causing a lot of this mental distress? I mean, I've been working and stuff like that, but I mean, think about the people who lost their jobs and stuff like that. So, and then the mobile crisis units, those make me concerned because there's talk about those mobile crisis units coming to our homes and forcibly removing people from homes. And we've talked to you about that in the past on multiple occasions. So I just want to share my concerns and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public on Zoom?
Veronica, go ahead and unmute your mic and give your comments.
Hi, it's Veronica Blake from Placer Community Foundation. If I'm reading the presentation right and the board right, it sounds like you're going to prioritize infrastructure funds for the South County Highway 65 corridor development. In light of the windfall, what would also be really helpful if you do that is to make sure that the development that's going on the 65 corridor fast tracks and prioritizes the affordable housing before the market rate development. I think it would make a lot of sense to do that given the crisis that we're in. Would love to see the funding go to North Auburn because Shauna Purvines has identified an enormous number of opportunity sites for affordable housing in North Auburn, and we'd love to see that barrier get removed. And then just want to backstop the great presentation on the need for broadband. The pandemic has definitely shown us the importance of making sure all of our residents have access to the internet to get information. So appreciate the good work you're doing. This is a tremendous opportunity for our community, and I really value all the thought and input that you're putting into it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Veronica.
Sean, go ahead and unmute your mic and give your comments.
Good afternoon, Chair Wygant, members of the board. Sean Barclay, General Manager of the Tahoe City Public Utility District. Thanks for the opportunity to make a brief comment to you today. I was here and made a comment to you at a previous Board of Supervisors meeting just for your consideration of establishing a competitive countywide community grant program to fund water infrastructure projects. And I'd just like to reiterate that in light of the fact that much of the West is currently on fire. Really just to remind you, the basis of our request was to help accelerate investments into our communities for water infrastructure for fire suppression in particular. And so I won't go through all of that request again, but I would just urge your consideration for setting some funding aside to really help meet a critical need throughout the county to invest in water infrastructure for firefighting. Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bradley, go ahead and unmute your mic and give your comments.
Thank you, members of the board. Brad Johnson, General Manager, North Tahoe Public Utility District. I just wanted to echo Sean Barclay's comments, emphasize the urgency of the need and the ability for these special districts who are eligible for ARP funding under the legislation to be able to put this money to work very, very rapidly. Our districts have identified a number of shovel-ready projects that will provide immediate benefit to the community and will help provide county-wide protection and resiliency against wildfire. Thank you for your consideration and time.
Thank you.
Chairman, no further public comment.
Thank you. Well, with that, bring it back to the board, and so I'm going to be asking Todd and Daniel at the end if you will, by the end of this, gotten enough direction from us to make sure you know your next steps. But I'll just open it up to all of us, and we can all just provide our direction, and if something comes up that maybe we need to resolve amongst ourselves, we can do that. But I'll start with Cindy and then Jim.
Well, I wanted to follow up on the last two callers because I have met with Sean and Brad, and I'm very familiar with the projects they're talking about that are not within their current customer base, which is why they're different than just asking for funds for a regular special district for this infrastructure need. But my caution to them and my question, I guess, to the county is, given how many special districts we have and how many water systems that we have, they've revised their request to be a countywide competitive program. I have no idea what the needs are for that. And obviously we have way more projects. We didn't even talk about biomass, which is certainly an issue for all of us, also in dealing with wildfire and consideration of how we can find a market for these wood products that are coming out of the forest. And so there's a lot of needs that aren't getting met. I understand their concern because they were skipped over, special districts were skipped over, but I did think we endorsed a letter to the state saying that special districts should be eligible for some of the state funding versus going to the individual counties. But I hesitate to even know how many special districts we have within the county. I mean, there's a lot, correct?
139.
Independent?
Yeah.
139 independent special districts. So I'm afraid if we do any sort of request for proposals, it would be overwhelming, and yet we are freeing up general funds, and we can certainly entertain over time thoughts about how we help these sorts of projects that they're proposing, because I do think they're critically important in various communities. I've heard from Midway, I think it's Midway Heights, or some of the infrastructure needs there. I know PCWA has identified that some of those small districts have critical infrastructure needs. They have no fire suppression water right now, and they're up and down the I-80 corridor in high hazard lands. So it really is going to take some thought, I think, in a longer term process to allocate our dollars into those sorts of projects today. But maybe in the future we undertake that discussion, because it goes hand in hand with our protection from wildfire to be able to get these communities fire suppression water. It was never a requirement, right? Never required of anybody to provide fire suppression water, which I think for most customers, they've never understood. What do you mean? Who else would put a fire hydrant out there except my water company? So just some thoughts on that. But I'm sorry to see we weren't far enough along to talk about biomass, but I still think anything we can do to find a market-based solution or a partial market-based solution to get more product and more forest fuels out of our forest and being used would be great. And maybe that's a later initiative that we can talk about as well. And maybe we can lobby the state, Joel, for some help again, because they took a lot of funding out of that. So those are my only thoughts. I think staff did an excellent job, and I will look forward to future discussions on how the offset money. I'm sorry. One other thought was this campus, right? If we move out of here at some point in the future, what are we doing here? And that's another county obligation that we need to think about setting money away from. So there's lots of county needs that we don't have all the funding for yet.
Jim, then Suzanne.
Thank you. Supervisor Guston, I agree with you. There's so many of these smaller independent water districts that actually have trouble finding board members, to say the least. And so I think working with the Placer County Water Agency and with the county to help them along, and maybe, I hate to say, annex into PCWA, something of that nature. So that's a very good point, and I think we should look forward to doing something like that. As far as the the potential county projects from the staff. I'm going to agree with them. I think they're well thought out. They're flexible, and some of those, like I say, some of those dollars that we've already got allocated can be pulled back and put into ongoing issues that we have throughout the county.
Suzanne?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First of all, I know we're only going to get half of the funds, or we've received half of the funds. So how is it going to work? Will we just, when we finally decide on a strategy here, will we start funding it half in the first year, or is there a plan?
Yeah, so just to answer that question, we received the first half in April, May. We'll receive the next half next May. Looking at the time frame, we'll be coming back to you and talking about the timeline for each of these projects. I know they will fit within that 3-year expenditure time frame. Some of these projects are going to take some time to get. I think we'll be okay in terms of the expenditure of that initial, basically $39 million. We'll get through that. We're not going to probably eat into anything above that because some of these projects take a little time to get off. So we'll work on it from a funding standpoint. In the event that we may need to upfront the money while we're waiting for the dollars to come in, we'll be coming back to you with an appropriation discussion at that point. But right now, I don't see us being in a kind of a catch where all these things will be expended before we receive the second half of the dollars.
Right, okay. And then my other question is, on all of these proposals for sewer, there's 3, the extension to Sunset, the Placer Ranch, and then Lincoln Sewer, which we didn't really talk about. So tell us a little bit, me and the public, how sewer works. Does the county pay for all sewer infrastructure, or do we get paid back? Just explain.
Ken can talk about it more articulately than I can.
Good.
So good afternoon, Ken Graham with Department of Public Works. So a couple different types of projects, and there's different ways that we can do it. The Sunset Sewer, Placer Ranch Sewer, generally all sewer infrastructure is paid by the users. And then when it's an expansion, it's paid by the future users, those developers as they're coming in paying their fees. There is an obligation as part of Placer Ranch to have that the county has a commitment, particularly associated with the university. I think the intent is the great portion will fulfill that commitment we have to the university and do it through sewer. But there'll also be another that eventually we would get connection fees that come back that can then revolve back into the community, into infrastructure, or into some other improvement that your board decides to do. Lincoln Sewer, very similar. There are some improvements that actually, probably those are improvements that are rehabilitation projects. Those are not really expansion projects. So they will go towards really fulfilling the ratepayers' obligation to keep the system up. And so that'll be the intent, including the lining of the emergency storage pond out there and some other improvements, including down at the Lincoln Treatment Plant that are the county's, North Auburn's obligation.
Okay, I'm a little concerned. Todd said that the plan was to be reimbursed, but that didn't give me a lot of comfort.
Yeah, so talk a little about the Sunset area to the casino. I mean,
first off, there are potential other partners out there in the Sunset area, but the largest is anyone who's going to connect up into the system. Those are all the developers that are left to go in. Each one has to pay a connection fee. A portion of that connection fee goes towards the treatment plant to keep the treatment plant expanding and available. There's another portion that goes towards the core infrastructure, backbone infrastructure within the Sunset area. So that portion, as everybody comes in, a portion, $1,000, $2,000 of each unit, will go towards reimbursing for that system. So they don't get something for nothing. But it is important to note that the county, your board, has made at least a portion, an obligation that they will participate in the infrastructure of Sunset. That portion would not get reimbursed, but the remaining would.
Okay, good. And then I have a last question about water. I'm not sure Ken, for you. I know you talk about PCWA, but the little lesser known is San Juan Water District that services all of the majority of my district, all of Granite Bay. And so I don't know. So when we talk about water, PCWA, can we kind of include San Juan Water in that discussion? I mean,
Sure.
We are fed from the surface water. We don't have underground storage. San Juan Water, we feed from the dam, and we're getting dangerously close to having to put dredges out there to suck the water up. And so I would just like to be included in that discussion.
Absolutely.
Great point.
Bonnie.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts as we think about funding. As I think about priorities, I feel like I consider the biggest priority that we should look at are what projects or what are the things that have been severely impacted because of COVID. So our mental health, substance abuse, I really appreciate Dr. Oldham giving us the background on the amount of money that his department is requesting. The crisis center at Kirby Hills, I think, is really important for our community to have. As we've seen more mental health issues because of the shutdown, and those aren't going to go away just because things have opened back up, and who knows where we're headed. So I really appreciate that, and additional funds for residential care for people who have substance abuse issues, the foster youth, the family or the mobile crisis center, and having people go out to families who are in crisis. And this is mental health. The gentleman asked about, mobile health clinics. These aren't people going out for the vaccinations. These are staff going out to help families in crisis when it comes to mental health, or a child spiraling out or something like that, which I think is really important. So I want to support the efforts that we have for Health and Human Services. Also, as a part of COVID has been the effect of housing. We've seen the increase of homelessness, and we also know that we have a crisis for affordable housing. So I do think that we need to look at using dollars to address those two items. And actually infrastructure, like in the North Auburn area, could certainly open up areas for affordable housing, right? So if we do sewer up in that North Auburn area, opportunity for infill, perhaps some affordable housing projects. I just want to look at making sure we set aside these dollars to address items that have been really affected because of COVID. And absolutely broadband, I think we need, we saw clearly during this last year that we need broadband. And so I'm very supportive of putting dollars in that area. And then, I've struggled a little bit with the infrastructure out to the west side of the county, but we continue to need jobs and housing, right? And so if we can help jumpstart the infrastructure out in the Placer Ranch area, so that we can have additional jobs and additional housing, I think that that's really important, because ultimately that allows for more stability for the residents in our community.
Thanks, Bonnie.
It on my comments.
Thank you. So I'll just a couple comments to add there. Probably obvious, but there's nothing on the list that I do not support. Sounds like the proportions and amounts are going to be fluid to some extent, but I think the prioritizations reflected in the amounts that there are for me, they're good. I think the economic development filter is valid. I think with those kinds of projects, we get jobs creation, which is a huge component of building healthy communities. And this is kind of an anomaly, but it gives public and everyone a sense of the dollar impact. But the memorandum with the tribe was an unusual thing, and it provided for them paying any and all taxes or the equivalent that any other business would pay. But the last time I checked, it's been 5 years, they have paid us over $150 million in monies or equivalent benefits that we would not have gotten but for lack of that collaborative agreement. So the other companies, they have to pay us those taxes anyway, but they also create jobs, and obviously those amounts of money can then be reinvested if we're wise. And so I think that's a great way to emphasize some of these priorities. And then aside from this, but to Cindy's comment about biomass, I think I'm very supportive of that. One of the things that on a state and national level makes me crazy. I just got back from vacation in Montana, and the smoke generally back there was generally as bad as it was here last summer for 3 months, and so I'm sure we're going to start to experience that any day now here again. Really a function of just the way the wind blows, literally. But I just saw in the clips today, I think that the Water Agency received a grant from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy as it relates to the Middle Fork project, and I see us maybe not with these dollars immediately, but we have the chance to really, I think, set an example, working collaboratively and being kind of a managing partner and setting an example for what should be happening in the Western United States. So that one really grabbed me, having driven through smoke all the way yesterday to get back home. Unfortunately, there was none right here now, but those are my comments and additions, and with that, I'll just open it. Suzanne? Yep.
Yeah, I just had one more comment that I actually was going to ask. Daniel, for the purposes of the public, this money is coming from the federal government, correct? Not from the state?
That's correct.
Okay, so where people may be concerned about commitments that we owe to the state, because of things they might impose on us, this money has nothing to do with the state. So there, in a sense, are no ties to this money.
That's correct. Unlike the CARES funds, these funds are a direct allocation from the Treasury, United States Treasury, to the counties, and will not pass through the state.
Okay. So if you have any issues, complain to your congressman or senator.
And just to build on that a little bit, when that did happen, the smaller jurisdictions had their monies filtered through the state. And in our case, in California, our money was delayed in a huge way compared to if we were a large enough jurisdiction to receive the monies directly. And the state did do some things like trying to restrict our behavior as it related to not how the money was spent so much, but how we lobbied for it and lobbied for our position for independence on public health authority. But so, yeah, that's a good comment, and in this case, I think a much better position for us.
Robert,
And Cindy, you?
I had one more question, I think more of Todd right now, or Daniel. In our high priority capital projects is the Tahoe Justice Center. Is there any nexus to the COVID response and critical services, because Tahoe is somewhat separate from accessing these other areas for the capital for that project? I don't know the status. I haven't had a status report recently on that.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about that. The state, we were kind of waiting to see if the state was going to give us some money towards or the courtroom side of that building. That's still in kind of works. I think that's been kicked out a year or two. If we're looking at anything tied to that project, the easy way to do eligibility would be more about public infrastructure, water, sewer into the site versus maybe the actual building or construction in itself. Okay. And that, and that's...
Well, and it can be eligible then for the general fund. We have it as a high priority to get that rebuilt, thankfully, at some point in our lifetimes.
Quick. That's correct. We can repurpose the dollars that we may have had allocated for some of these towards other things. Maybe biomass, maybe some that property as well.
Okay, thanks.
Bonnie, anything else? Okay.
No, nothing else from me. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Todd, Daniel, Karen, is that good enough? Do you have from us what we needed for this workshop? There are no other questions? There's enough specific direction?
No specific questions from my perspective. I think we have the information that we need to put together. Kind of my anticipation is put together our first performance project plan, which is more of our guiding document of how we plan to use these funds in an overall picture, and then maybe bring that back in draft form to your board in early August based on this conversation, and then that will go forward to serve our first report due at the end of August, and I think that will align quite nicely for us.
Yeah, good. So point on that would be that this is the first major step by the board in a process that will emerge and become more detailed over time.
Exactly.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks. All right, with that, then we are adjourned for the day.